everybody. Welcome to day 2 of ArCONa, a witchy-themed online convention. My name is Celeste Conowitch. I'm going to be your moderator for today's panel, and I'm just super-duper thrilled to have an awesome conversation about magic systems in TTRPGs. And, of course, I have some wonderful panelists here. So I'm going to give you all a little bit of admin details, and then we're going to go around and meet all of these fine folks we're going to be talking to today. So, yes, this is ArCONACon. Everything that you see here, we are raising money for Bat Conservation International's mission to end bat extinctions worldwide. Bats are super duper important to every ecosystem. They are night pollinators, critical to our ecosystem. So please donate to support our fundraiser. You can find the donate link in chat. Thank you so much to our wonderful moderators who are handling that and below in this Twitch panel right here. I also have a bat fact that I am supposed to give you. So if you watch every single panel, you will hear a different bat fact every time. So here we go. My bat fact: bats are one of the many animals that help with reforestation of the world's rainforests. Seeds dropped by bats can account for up to 95% of the first new growth. Which is absolutely amazing. So please do consider donating. But what are we doing here? What is this panel? So like I said, the name of this panel is Magic Systems in TTRPG, which stands for Tabletop Role-Playing Games. If you're not familiar with the tabletop role-playing game, these are games that are pretty much primarily take place in the imagination. Usually you have one person who's a storyteller, game master, narrative director of a game, and then a bunch of people who are portraying characters or other elements that work in the game. These are a little bit different from games that you buy in a box. You don't have to have a computer to play these games. A lot of it is collaborative storytelling, so it's a very unique and very special experience. And of course, why it's relevant for ArCONa and magic systems is that a lot of these games do feature magic. So, when you think of your archetypal wizards, spell slingers, that sort of thing, anything you might see in a fantasy novel or a science fantasy novel, what we do as designers, as game masters, is figure out ways to gamify magic and put rules to it so people can experience it themselves. But I've been talking for a very long time, so let's go around and meet the experts that we have today with us. So I would love if you all could introduce your names, your pronouns, and then tell us a little bit about your experience with TTRPGs. So Natalia, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks so much, Celeste.
Yeah.
So my name is Natalia Dean, please. I'm among friends, so everyone feel free to call me Talia. I use she, her for pronouns. Game experience is pretty long and varied. Have stayed out of the sun for most of my life, so hopefully I look a little younger than I actually am, but I've been playing games since the early 90s, all different styles, systems, you name it. And I've been lucky enough to be able to do writing for several tabletop RPGs. So I've worked with Eclipse Phase, which doesn't have a magic system because it's sci-fi, conspiracy, and horror, but I'm also one of the primary writers and developers for Clockwork Dominion, which is steampunk role-playing in a Victorian world of Gothic horror. And there's a lot of magic and mystery in that setting. And also personally, my academic background, I have a master's degree in medieval and early modern European studies, and I've written several hundred pages of thesis work on witchcraft and possession cases in the 15th through 17th centuries. So yeah, I like magic stuff.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Talia. And Jackie, who are you and what is your experience in the world of TTRPGs?
Oh, thank you, Celeste. My name is Jackie. My pronouns are he, him. I go by Death by Mage on the internet, and I have been playing TTRPGs since probably right at the cusp of 2000. So I've been playing around for a long time, and I will say that I primarily have played mostly fantasy settings for the longest time before I moved into sci-fi. And for Magic set, and for that, I probably spent more time researching and doing my own personal research on magic systems, and actually doing magical studies, because I can remember that when I got into other certain tabletop games, I probably had spent way too much time reading a lot of Judeo-Christian texts, and probably spent way too much time reading up on demonology as well. I actually at one point was apprenticed to a demonologist so that was a little interesting of a time. And I will say that I'm also a game designer. I also write for TTRPGs and publish in different with other people. I am currently the creative lead for Unbreakable Anthology, which is a Asians Own Voices platform for telling Asian stories by Asian creators.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Jackie. And Sam, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sam. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a little bit newer to the tabletop roleplay gaming space. I just started a few years ago. I think my first like D&D campaign as a player was in 2017. But since then, I've actually become kind of like obsessed with game running and storytelling. So I DM more than I play now, which is really fun. But I've been, as far as like magical background, I've been practicing witchcraft for about 15 years. So it's very cool to like get to play around with different magic systems in gaming spaces because I have all of this knowledge from like my real life practice that I'm not necessarily able to incorporate at the table, but like kind of make comparisons and like pull in different facets of that when I'm building characters or building out lore or like creating stories, which is really fun. So yeah.
Awesome. And like I said, my name is Celeste Konowich. My pronouns are she, her. I have been a game master for about 15 years or so. Absolutely, like I think many of us here, just fascinated by magic, by fantasy, by telling these epic stories. I produce and make the actual play podcast Venture Maidens, which has been running for 5.5 years. I am a full-time game designer with 2C Gaming and do a lot of freelance work with Wizards of the Coast, Kobold Press. Currently writing my own book. So like I'm really excited for this discussion because I think it will really help me as I'm writing the Venture Maidens campaign guide, talk about magic and how it all works. So for those of you out there, just letting you know kind of the format here, we have some questions that I'm going to pose and we're going to have a general discussion about those. And then probably if we have some time at the very end, I'll be taking some questions from chat for our awesome panelists here. But let's dive in. Let's talk about how the heck do we do this? How do we take something as big and broad and complicated as magic and put it into our games? So I thought what we could do, starting things off, maybe just asking, what is your favorite thing about experiencing magic in tabletop games? Like, what is the thing that draws you in and just makes this just an exciting thing? So Talia, why don't we go ahead and start with you? So what is your favorite thing about experiencing magic in tabletop role-playing games?
The best thing that I can have as a player, as a storyteller, as someone who's writing something, as someone who's running a game for people at a convention that are strangers that I've never met before, is when something about a magic system can just completely shatter somebody's idea about what the horizons of possibility are at the table and in the story of the game. Because if I can deliver on that, that means that now all of a sudden I've got them. Like that person is going to care about what's happening. They're going to start wanting to poke their fingers and all the weird stuff at the edges of what's happening, what's not happening. It's going to raise questions. It's going to make somebody hungry to engage with the game. And that's something that can be shared between two people at a table when it's like, hey, I can do this thing with my character that opens up a possibility for you. It might be a way for players to catch the GM a little bit by surprise. I'm sure that happened to all of us. As the GM, it can be something where it's like, even if you've had someone who's played TTRPGs for years or decades, or, sometimes even somebody who has helped develop or write the system you're playing in, if you can do something a little unexpected or a little bit different with them, all of a sudden they're back to, this is the first time I'm sitting down at the table. This is the first time I'm like, I really don't know what's going to happen next in the story. And no matter where I am at the table or in the design process or discussion, to me, that's a magical moment. That's something that gives me a lot of life and energy. So I love seeing that.
Oh, man, yes, absolutely. And I don't know about you, but like when I've run for games for like cons or for new people, and you have a player who's a little bit hesitant to play, and then they sit down, and the first time they realize they can fly or they can like cast fire, you just see their eyes like light up as the possibility unfolds. It's pretty magical. So Jackie, what is it about games for you, experiencing magic, that you find so wonderful?
I think for me, it always comes down to the personal experience of like the journey that you have, because magic itself is most of the time a personal journey.
Yeah.
Even if you are among others, it's still a journey within your inner self as you interact with the outside world and beyond. And I think when I have others think about how their relationship between themselves, their characters when they're playing a TTRPG, and then also thinking about how their characters um, react and interact with magic itself and what that means to them. I think that creates that such an emotional bond, and that is probably one of the things that I enjoy seeing, is that strengthening emotional bond and that connection to that there is more beyond just what's on the paper, what's in our minds. There's so much more forward, and that is probably the one of the greater joys I have, especially when I love people coming to me, even when I GM for them, and they're asking me, can't asking me how to push the boundaries of what the system can let them, and I'm like, please push the system. I want to see your creativity. I want to see what you think you can do, because this is where magic really lies. It's not about the boundaries that are written on paper. It's about what your mind wants to happen, and that is what magic always has been. So let it out, show it, and connect with it, and then you can and there have been times where a lot of people have actually connected with it and saw that there's more to it and how much it relates to them, because there's always a reflection of how they want the magic to be presented, and it's a reflection of themselves, and I love that self-discovery.
Yeah, it does feel really like ultimate creativity, sort of, in a way.
Hmm.
Yeah, I love that about Magic. It feels like permission, I feel like, in tabletop games to really let your imagination just fly and kind of do whatever. You really are only constrained by your own power, which has always been true of Magic, which is so exciting. And Sam, what about for you? Something about experiencing Magic that is just incredible.
So kind of building on what everybody has said, like I'm a very rules light GM. So my thing is that when I sit down at a table with any players, whether they're brand new or whether they're really experienced or somewhere in the middle, I want everybody to feel like their creativity is not going to be blocked by the restrictions of the system that's in place. So like, for example, I'm running a Strahd campaign right now with Dungeons and Dragons for the first time. And so I have a bunch of Magic users. I have 8 players, which is
Whoa, your
it's
hero.
so many.
Oh my
it's
gosh.
so many.
I
And
remember that life.
yeah, it's a lot. And a bunch of them are Magic users. And so some of them are kind of hesitant to be like, well, I have this spell. I don't know if it will make sense in this context. Can I do this? And it's like, how can we make it work? Because my thing is like, if you have a cool idea, let's figure it out. And so for me, the cool thing is when you can take magic and you can do that little, kind of like Talia was saying, do that little twist and make it something unexpected, or have the result be something unexpected, because I think that that can just really invigorate a party and invigorate a table and create so many new possibilities for where the story can go. And so nothing is ever too closed off, like nothing is ever impossible, which I think is very, very important, especially when you're doing collaborative storytelling, for sure.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean, we've all kind of used words like systems and brought up like these different games. So I am definitely really curious to talk about. I mean, there are a lot of different tabletop role playing games out there, and a lot that use magic and have very different mechanics for how you take something kind of cerebral, something so large, and how do you gamify it. So I was curious to ask you all about what games have you encountered that you feel have a really elegant or interesting way of presenting gaming mechanics, maybe even things that you personally really feel like this is how magic would be. So what are those games for you, Jackie? I see you brought a prop.
I
So
I
let's
brought a
start with
prompt.
you. Like
I brought a prompt. So so I will say one of the biggest breakout games for me was but I had my start with D&D years ago, but the game that held me onto TTRPGs for the longest time would definitely have to be White Wolf's Mage the Ascension. And I will say that this is the 20th anniversary, by the way, so don't be intimidated by the
it's
fact that
huge,
this
yeah.
book is a dictionary. This is like several books shoved into one final book that has gone through several revisions over many years. So don't be intimidated by this. Like you can still get Mage, 20th anniversary or other versions of Mage, and you'll be fine. Or alternatively, I would also recommend Mage the Awakening, but which is done with Chronicles of Darkness. But the idea behind the thing I have always connected with Mage and between both Mage Ascension and Awakening has been like a lot of the early interpretations of it is very similar to how magic manifests, at least how practices of magic are usually manifested, which is there's always an intent, there's always a connection to whether it be yourself or some other source, and then it is then about whether or not and then it depends, and then what Mage does, it includes this factor of reality, which is reality wants to stay rigid, wants to maintain this sense of self, and it basically has paradigms and rules. And what magic tends to violate those things, or rather push it to its boundaries. And sometimes, and because of those pushbacks, reality has to push back as well. And so you create this thing called paradox. And so you have the risk of paradox when you cast magic. And so it creates this balancing force. And paradox in Mage the Ascension is actually referred to more of the global subconscious, the human subconscious, like what is within the human subconscious as a whole. And because the masses have this certain paradigm established, that's what makes reality work. And Mage is pushing against it, creates a feedback because those who are not connected to this magic cannot accept this reality, and therefore there's that pushback. And so it creates this nice little dialogue that reflects even modern times, where we have people who are practitioners, who are working practitioners, and then you have the relationship with the rest of the world, where they may not believe those things, and you have that kind of pushback. So I love that kind of commentary that was built into the game, but I also love that at the core of everything in the game is really about the basic elements of how crafting magic works, which is intent, connection, and basically manifesting.
Yeah, very cool. Sam or Talia, do you all have any experience with Mage in particular?
Mhm.
Yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, it's I remember playing it for the first time. Yeah, my my dear friend Sage showed up to game night with that book and was like, "Boom!" And I was like, "I'm afraid." And it took. I feel like Mage in particular, because there are no like. I mean, there are example spells of like if you have dots in this and dots in this, you can
Mhm.
do this. But those are very few, and it really encourages you to look at the different ways magic is cast and kind of creatively shape your own
Mhm.
spells. And I know for
Yeah.
me, that was so hard to wrap my brain around because I was very used to games with very rigid magic structures, things like Dungeons and Dragons, where it's like, here are your spells. And that's it.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
Yeah.
there's no real way to create spells. So
Yeah,
that's
this is the game that actually lets you create spells. Like the spheres themselves, for those who are interested, there are spheres of magic, and within each spheres there are levels of it. And the deeper you go into something, you gain more access to mastering it, which is basically how you manipulate those spheres to do certain things. But even then, at that point in the game, the gamification kind of slowly gets less and less, because it's more about what you interpret. And actually, Ascension, I would say a lot of people who storytell for it usually find this the most intimidating, because it really is defined by it is limited literally by the imagination of both the players and the storytellers. So having a very open storyteller and a player, or even just someone learning to open up to other ideas, this can seem intimidating to a lot of people. And that is and I will say it feels intimidating, but once you realize it can be anything you need it to be or anything you want it to be, then it opens a lot more doors for you.
Yeah.
These games really live and die by whether or not the storyteller and the players can have a conversation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Sense it's not something that, yeah, if you're going to go into that super rules restrictive, you're not going to have a good time.
Yeah.
No.
Definitely.
And I mean, like, to me, that's one of the things that I always try to consider first when I'm looking at a game for the magic system. Is this meant to be a set of supportive mechanics?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, very much true for D&D in all of its iterations. And they've opened up more story options with that over time. So please don't take that as a criticism. But it is there to make sure that as a campaign progresses, you're going to have some people around the table who are going to be able to throw large fistfuls of dice at certain problems, or that they're going to be able to say, we can overcome this obstacle by using this amount of a limited resource. And that's important. That's an important part of balancing and pacing character development, opening a range of story options, what you can do, and it still provides an outlet for creative play. But then there are other games like Mage. One of my personal favorites is Nobilis, where the magic systems are much, much, much more open. And I would say Nobilis is probably the most open, unless you're going like straight up rules light, where it's literally just, there's a loose framework for how you as a player says, I'm introducing this thing. And, you can basically do whatever you want as long as it's certain types of flavors. But games like that, where magic systems primarily have a narrative impact. They're not there to necessarily say, I do X amount of damage, or, we can or can't do this one specific thing. They may, but they're more about exploring that possibility space. And they're more there explicitly to serve as a prompt and a creative outlet for the people that are playing, both storytellers and players.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as you can see, kind of chat, we're starting to even just poke this topic. Like, there are so many different ways to represent mechanics, to represent so many different kinds of players. People who do, crave that rigidity and structure. Sometimes people want systems that go super hard into that. They need points and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. That speaks to a lot of players. And then there are others who really do want that full control and ability to use their imagination to create anything and don't like having points and rules and standards. So when you design a game, it's a huge choice to make. What kind of accessibility do you want to have? What is the interface going to be between the imagination, the rules, and the story you're telling? Sam, did you have any games that you would like to bring up for this topic?
So I really like the magic system in Blades in the Dark and Forged in the Dark, because there's that concept of like, so you're casting a spell, or you're making a decision, you're doing an action, and depending on how you roll, you're either going to succeed and there's going to be like very minimal or even no consequences, or you might still succeed but there are heavier consequences. And so it's less like one of the things that I like about D&D is that it's like, okay, if you hit this number you succeed, and if you hit this number you fail, because sometimes that's like what you need to like move things forward, especially in like a combat situation where it's just like, let's clip it along, so those are going to be here for 7.5 hours. But but with Fortune in the Dark and with Blades in the Dark, you have this kind of not nebulous, but like it's a little bit more give and take. There's a little bit more, almost like there's a little bit more risk, because you have to choose very carefully whether you feel like you can make that decision or cast that spell and then accept whatever may come back to you. Which can affect not only what happens to your character, but what happens to everyone in the party and everything that's going on in that world. And so, especially because those games are very based in like, like it's very like post-apocalyptic and very like, or at least the ones that I played, I know that there are several that are in that system, but you're constantly making a decision of like, is it safe to do this, knowing that it might not go well, in a way where I could actually be doing more harm. You know what I mean? And I think that that's really interesting. And I think that it also is very, I sometimes will incorporate that into D&D spells. Like I'll offer that as opposed to like, okay, so you failed and nothing happened. It's like, okay, you failed and also this occurred.
Maybe
Because
we'll
I think that
epically fail.
because I think it's more interesting than just like the pass fail system, if that makes sense.
I think magic having consequences is also hugely important for how it's positioned in the world, like plot wise, what's the feel around the table. And I think that one of the things that really shows now that, and I have to remember that I don't have to filter myself as heavily for this conversation for ArCONa than I might in more general gaming spaces, is that when you have, and like Mage is a good example, just for my own work and in Clockwork, when you have people that are engaged in the design process who pursue magic or other esoteric spiritual practices in their own lives, that makes a huge difference in how it can be conceptualized. I mean, if you have, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson that are coming out of, this very, very like numbers, dice, pass, fail, yes, no, damage, death, whatever, from a wargaming background, you're going to get a fancy magic system. It's you've got a certain amount that you can do, yep. Consumable resources, points, damage, pass, fail, yes, no, whatever. But when you have a whole, and I want to say, I'm only mentioning a couple games that this is true across a wide swath of the games industry. There are a lot of people who have a very broad variety of personal magical and spiritual practices that they bring into their work, sometimes in some extremely subtle ways. But that's something that whereas that flavor of magic, what does it have in the setting, I think is also a really important piece that more games sense, and Mage was really important along with a lot of work that was coming out of White Wolf as a studio, like that change of how are mechanics something that is going to intrinsically support some of the themes of gameplay. And that's something that's only grown, especially in magical systems. And also as a middle-aged white lady, it's also been really, really great to see that it's not just middle-aged white people that are doing game design in a big audience. I love seeing shit that is completely different from my own experiences.
Yeah, that actually touches on a great kind of topic for our next question, because, magic has been represented and such a cornerstone of cultures and, zeitgeist mythology. Like, there definitely are some challenges to, representing magic well. And like, how do you do that? How do you take something so broad with so many different connotations and interpretations and put it into a game? So I did want to bring up, what are some of the challenges that come with representing a topic as broad as magic in games? I think you kind of touched on that. Like, what do we do for like cultural considerations? Like, how do we take, magic is a real system of belief and faith in a lot of places, and like, how do we represent that? There's so much. So Sam, why don't we start with you? What are some of the challenges you come up with, either designing or running or like being a player? Like, what are some of the challenges of representing magic in games?
I think I haven't run into this a whole lot, because a lot of the people that are like in my circle of friends that I play games with are people who do practice magic in some way, whether it's something that is incorporated into like their culture or their ancestry, or it's something that they've kind of discovered on their own and tooled around with. So each of us kind of brings in our own specific like interpretation of magic. Although I guess that's sort of a challenge in and of itself, right? Is that everybody has their own
idea,
concept of like what magic is and what it can do, right? And so then you end up in this space of like, so you want it to work this way. In the gaming setting that we are using, it works this way. How can we make those things mesh and also not make anybody else feel like they've been like closed off at the pass? I haven't really encountered it enough for it to be like something that I have advice or like, suggestions about how to circumnavigate. But I think that in some ways, everybody bringing their own understanding of it to the table and then having to incorporate that into like a rules system, whether it's rules light or rules heavy, does sort of force you to learn how to communicate at the table in a new way, which is one of my favorite things about tabletop roleplay, is that it really forces you to like not just collaboratively storytell with your friends, which is fun, but also to figure out how to like get past mental blocks or how to get through situations where it's like, I don't know how I as a person would interpret this, but like this is maybe how my character would deal with it. And so it kind of forces you to step a little bit outside of yourself and like really into that role play space and really like kind of push the boundaries of your own understanding and your own concepts in order to be on the same page as somebody else.
Yeah, I
If
think
that makes
that's
sense.
yeah, I think that's a great and a really huge point because like everyone, when you think of magic, I say magic, you all probably think of something in your head,
Mhm.
and what that is so vastly different from person to person. So yeah, trying to manage, I guess, or move a story along when everybody has this wildly different understanding is definitely a challenge. Jackie, what about you? What are some of the challenges you see in bringing magic into tabletop role playing games?
So I think I can definitely do a little behind the curtains when it comes to Unbreakable because we're dealing with different Asian cultures which actually have their own different beliefs, stories, cultures, heritage. There are different traditions within even just a single country. And we, for the most part, in the beginning, in the first volume, we didn't have as much of an issue with a lot of the magic because a lot of it could be repurposed or reinterpreted in through D&D 5e. Moving forward, however, was a different story because when we started moving into the next two volumes, we decided to go more indie RPGs as well as doing 5e on the later two. But the indie side of things was where I think we got to see a lot of our writers and contributors actually kind of move away from those molds and try exploring more. And we actually encouraged it a lot. Across all our contributors, regardless of what book they were working in, and I can say that there was definitely the fact that magic has so much has so much uh is derived from culture and and it derives from culture. It has its own kind of science attached to it because a lot of cultures with when they produce science actually also usually create a form of esoteric
Mm.
belief systems or methods or practices with it. And so when it comes down and then when I reflect on myself with a lot of like Taoist practices, because that was a thing I was delving in for last like 8 years. I want to say that when it comes to representing it can be a very tricky thing, because you have you there's ways it can easily go wrong. That's what I can say. It can easily go
Yeah.
wrong, more so than going right. And the thing is too, some practices and some traditions are very tied to have very have certain elements where they're not supposed to be shared. These are things you're not supposed to tell other people. These are things that are intrinsic to that, and you have to respect those things sometimes if you do actually spend the time researching those things, realizing that there are things that you're not supposed to know about them because they are part of their identity. And right, and then you have to find a way to kind of be respectful to those things, and then find a way where making it work for you without as best as you can, really. And really sometimes getting that middle ground is harder than it sounds, and sometimes you won't be able to please everyone. That's the reality of it. And but I think the only thing I would say is, especially for when we had to hire consultants and things like that, that was also equally a challenge. And thankfully, we had a lot of volunteers and we had a lot of people who were coming in that we paid for. But it is a challenge, because there are elements that some people may not have any knowledge or experience in, and then trying to connect to those things makes it very difficult because now you're the mouthpiece of this particular thing, and you're now representing it, and you have to be very mindful of that. And I will say that for the most part, even I would say the best thing I have that we recommend to some of our writers is just to use what they know and don't go beyond that, and to just um remind be and we just be mindful of the fact that other people who are coming in, which is our consultants, may have different experiences and they may not actually mesh, because we actually had a few times where we had people of similar cultures but of different beliefs coming in and realizing that, oh, my belief on how this is interpreted is not the same as yours. And sometimes we've had to kind of be the middle person and just go, Okay, everyone just calm down and let's just acknowledge that we all have different experiences. And acknowledging that, I think, is also equally important. I think that is the most important thing about Magic in any game system, is to acknowledge that everyone's interpretation and experiences and connection to Magic is always going to be different, because everyone has idiosyncrasies. We all have a different way if we understand it, even if it's the same kind of practices. We have a different relationship to it, and so we just have to acknowledge it and respect that.
Yeah, I mean, magic is so incredibly personal. I think any practitioner or anyone who's familiar just with literature in general, reading about the experience of people who interface with magic, or the people who are actually using magic into their day to day lives, it is so personal, so close to the heart and the mind. And then when you look at that on the larger, cultural scale, it is so tied to the history of specific peoples and places. I mean, just off the top of my head, there are a lot of big problems, in role playing games with how to represent magic. I mean, looking at the way witches are represented in Magic, for one, or looking at the way shamans are represented. Those are just two big examples of many of the things that people continually struggle with. How do we do this? How do we do this in a way that's respectful and meaningful? Is certainly a huge challenge. And Talia, what are some of the challenges that you see or have experienced in bringing magic to these games?
Yeah, so I mean, I just couldn't agree more with all the points that have already been raised.
Oh yeah.
You know, personally, in my own individual life and practice, I'm a syncretic magician. I don't necessarily ascribe to a particular tradition or one set. I have my own interpretation of what the spiritual ordering of things in the world and such looks like. And my personal conception of magic is that it's a toolkit. That if I'm performing something, if I'm doing any type of observance, I might pull from one particular tradition for one thing, something completely different for something else. I may make something up completely from scratch for a third thing. And that was definitely something that was very much borne in mind. And you'll see that if you look at the design work that I've done for Clockwork, where I actually did most of the mechanical implementation of the magic system. But the other primary writer who's doing work on the magic system is an ordained Anglican priest.
Wow.
Who
That's
also
that's
has,
an experience.
yeah, in various flavors of religious studies. And, looking at that, the way that those experiences were commingled, and some of the discussions were absolutely a little bit contentious, because one of us wanted to push or pull a little more towards one side
Right.
of that spectrum or the other.
Can imagine.
But it ultimately worked, because the way that we decided to approach it, and this is very much into like general setting and kind of the core precepts of underpinning the idea of the game world. And I think that that's one thing that anybody who's doing any type of design work, and even if you're writing your own game, that's design work. Don't sell yourselves short, people in the audience. But anyone who's doing any type of design work, you want to start by saying, well, what role is magic going to fill? Is it there primarily for mechanical power escalation, XYZ, very like by the number stuff? Is it something that's going to be very, very narrative, with very open-ended, very rules light, very open to interpretation? Is it somewhere between those two? Have that conception first, because that's going to inform the types of stories that you want to tell, how you're going to describe it in the game, how you're going to talk about the players that want to be magicians. But then if you're talking about the mechanical systems of it, you want to make sure that that's reflected. If you're treating magic as something that is dangerous and not entirely knowable, it's not something that's fully predictable, and you're going more of like the Blades in the Dark description that Sam brought up, that's a really, really good way to, if you're the narrator who's talking about the effects of a spell going off, you can really play with that. You can describe, you can use language that is a little ambiguous when you're saying, oh, well, yes, you did manage to conjure fire and darkness into the group of enemies, and you don't know exactly what the mechanical effects of that were. You just know that you succeeded.
Yeah.
There
It
are ways
looks
that you can
fine
play with that.
here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There are ways you can play with that at the table. If you're going into the actual hard mechanics of it, the way that we kind of threaded the needle for Clockwork specifically, and this comes from, it's not exhaustive, it can't be, there's no universal conception of magic culturally, but we did try to look at, because the game does presuppose that there is a creator deity, and that magic was essentially, it's essentially treated as admin access to the way that reality is set up.
Cool.
and that angels and other celestial beings had that originally. Some angels rebelled, fell, basically said like, nah, screw this, I'm gonna actually exert free will. But when they started interacting with mortals, that was an easy way for them to gain power and influence, etc. So they put magic out in the world, and humans started doing all sorts of things they weren't supposed to do with it. So for our system, we really wanted to get a little bit of both and. So because magic is something that's written to the way that reality works, if you find a properly composed magical rite and you do what it says, you do have to make a roll to see whether or not you actually do it correctly. But if you do what it says, it'll work. You do not have to be a magician. I could find this in a book. It could be introduced as by the narrator as part of a plot element. It could be something that happens once or twice in the entire campaign, all well and good. If you want to be a magician, you could use character assets to maybe like, well, I actually inherited this spell book from my grandparent, and it has a couple of real functional magical rites in it. If you want to really, really get into it, you can actually use character assets to master words of power, which allow you to shape and set up sentences for intent. So if I want to like restore the body of a mortal, I can, you lost a limb, I can do a really big, complicated, involved, difficult rite, and bam, you get your limb back. If you're like, oh, you know, my friend Jackie came over and he seems a little bit under the weather. And I'm like, you know what, Jackie, give me 15, 20 minutes. Don't come into the kitchen. And I'm going to come back and here's going to be the slightly weird smelling cup of tea. But you sip that and then you no longer have the flu. So it's something where the magic system can really kind of expand or contract as much as you need it to for the purposes of the story. And there are a couple of different ways for players to engage with it. Like I said, because we were really trying to find that middle ground just to make it more approachable to a broader variety of players. And also because we didn't say you have to do exactly this in order to get that effect, you could have people from 20 different cultures in the world who have 30 different ways of performing the exact same rite in terms of the exact same mechanical outcome, and still have that unique and correct within their cultural and esoteric practices. So again, we tried to leave the door open, and that was very much out of an acknowledgement that, you know, if we just present, okay, well, here's another slightly different spin on a Victorian conception of magic, yay.
Yay.
There's not too much very special about that. So we really wanted to try to put that through. But yeah, and it's not something that we did perfectly. You know, I don't think that there's a game system out there yet that has nailed it to be amazing and awesome for all people. And you know, maybe some of you listening, maybe you're going to be the people to design that. So, you know, keep taking a crack.
Yeah, I think we can all acknowledge, you know, magic is messy, and you know, trying to make it clean and structured in these games is a huge challenge. Um, so I also wanted to go around just as an idea, because we all do have, you know, experience with these games and some design experience, design storytelling. If folks were interested in getting into, you know, design and looking and learning about more magical systems, I wanted to ask you all, what are your inspirations? Like when you look at magic, or, you know, you're talking about it, what kind of stories do you go to? What kind of media do you go to? Where do you draw your magical inspiration? Um, Jackie, why don't we start with you? Where do you go for your magic
Oh man,
inspiration?
that's gonna be a lot. That can be a lot of places
Okay, then your
because
top three favorites.
my top three. Okay, my top three. I will say I grew up actually watching when I was a kid. I grew up watching a lot of Chinese like shangsha's, which are basically like the Chinese fantasy genre,
Cool.
and those were the things I grew up watching a lot of as a kid. Because I had like VHSs of those things when growing up, so we had those, and and that was my first exposure to magic was from my own culture. With and they were things that I didn't think about until much later, years later. And then I think the biggest one that drew me in years later was I got really into ancient Egypt,
Mm.
and that so anything from ancient Egypt is always an inspiration for me. And then I think the other thing that drew me for the longest time was I remember reading Jim Butcher's Dresden
Oh,
series.
love
That
it.
is
Love those books.
that is very that one hit me for the longest time. I got into that like right out of high school. And that has definitely been a nice interesting take on kind of like your like urban fantasy and urban magic, and that was one of those things I love about it. That's one of my favorite genres is urban magic, so it's like I love it. And Dresden Files has always been a good series to me.
Heck yeah. And Sam, if people are looking for a little magical inspiration, where would you send them?
Yeah, so I don't design games, but I do write fiction and nonfiction. So I mean, I've grown up reading so many different types of fantasy books, and like I just recently got really, really into like gay sci-fi, which is super fun. So off the top of my head, this might seem like an odd answer, but one of my favorite like fantasy series is actually the Percy Jackson series, which is literally for children. It's fine. But one of the things that I like about that series is that it's a fairly diverse group of characters who all have neuroatypical brains. And so it's this group of kids who are really powerful and do these really amazing things, but they're not like they're neurodivergent and they have these disabilities and they have these different things going on, but they're still like very powerful and they're still heroes. And I think that one of the things that I encounter a lot of times in fantasy is like just like really blatant ableism that like kind of shines through in big ways. And then as a fat woman reading fantasy, there's always like the villain coded fat character somewhere someone is fat and it's a bad thing, right? And so it's very cool to like read a series, and that's the only like I guess recent read, because I just recently reread them, so like at the top of my brain, but where it's like here's a group of characters, they don't fit the usual fantasy mold, and they're also going to inspire like a whole generation of kids to like really step forward and like learn that they can do things and they can be magical and they can be heroes without being neurotypical, able-bodied, thin, white, straight, cisgender, you know what I mean? And so like all of that is like very cool to see in like one collection of books. So
Heck yeah. And Talia, where would you send people kind of just curious to learn more about magic or get inspired to make their own stories?
So books are always going to be an easy go-to, and I know that sounds like a cop-out because it's such an wide answer, but the thing is that when you're engaging with a book, you're always going to be engaging it in a way that is unique to you. Your interior experience. Are you seeing pictures in your head? Can you hear the characters' voices? Is it just something where there's something unique about the rhythm and stanchion of the words and how they read out in your mind? Is there something that grabs you there? Is there something that makes that special? And because, especially fiction, it's always going to be a generative work. It always comes with inspiration and things like that, but it's still coming in some way ex nihilo. And I think that's something that's really important for any type of magic, is it should be something where you are given X and you can get X plus infinity out of it. You know, however big or small of a difference that is, you're taking something in and you are making it greater in your own mind, in your own spirit, in your own heart. Because that is something that is fundamental to any expression of magic from any culture, any time, any religiosity. That is something that it should be a unique internal experience. To that end, I'm not going to be completely dodging the question on that. One of my favorite authors for that sense, for modern writers, is China Miéville, especially the novel Kraken. And there are a couple of short stories in the short story collection, 3 Moments of an Explosion, that are just for interesting, cool conceptions of magic that are really something amazing to glom onto. I also think that you should look to just something that you think is just fucking awesome. Like that can be any type of piece of media. That could be a cool visual effect. That could be a poem. That could be just something that grabs you in some way that you don't ever feel compelled to try to explain or justify to other people. It's just something that you can see and it really lights you up. Because again, to me, that's what I always want to try to evoke when magic is included in a story, in a game system, whatever. That it's something that should be extraordinary. It should be special. It should be unique to the person and the context of what's going on at that time. third thing, it's hard to narrow down. But
I know.
I will say that you can find moments of other of the two other points that I've made in looking back at history. When you look at magic, always primarily exists in the margins. It's something, I mean, occult literally just means hidden. It's something that is just out of sight. It's at the corner of your vision. It's something you have to dig into a little bit to get at. And whether that's looking at historical documents, which I've spent a lot of time doing, whether that's something where you're just going through all sorts of different reference material from other cultures, other religions, other esoteric practices, there are going to be things that really catch your eye, that make you, that really grab you. And also, in any way that you yourself are not, you are not, don't have that in common with the majority of the world, look to that. I'm a trans woman and a queer person. Like, I've had to dig really, really hard to find representation and ideas that I feel are special to me in my experience. And there's magic there. We all have things about us that are hidden, that are private, that are personal. And that's, to me, that's always going to be the biggest, strongest wellspring for any idea or conception of magic.
Well said. Extremely well said. And I do feel like we are living in a really, really cool time where a lot of new folks are discovering tabletop role playing games and magic and fantasy in general. I think for the first time we're really seeing that come to the forefront of pop culture, which is really interesting. So you can go on to Netflix and you can watch a fantasy show. You can see something like the way the Magicians does magic, or the way the Witcher does magic, or you can pop in a video game, like play even Hades, a roguelite game, like how do they deal with magic, gifts from the gods. There are so many ways now that are really accessible to see and hear and feel and read people's different interpretations of magic. It really is spreading through so many different things and aspects of culture. So we're pretty much almost at the end of our time here. Sorry we didn't get to audience questions. This was just such an awesome conversation. Thank you all so much for being here. I did want to go around and let's do some outros. So please do follow all of these wonderful folks. They're going to tell you where you can go to do that. So Jackie, where can people go to find you, support you, and your work?
Okay, yeah. You can follow me on Twitter at Death by Mage. I'm mostly there all the time. I'm usually retweeting a lot of the wonderful projects other people do because I want to share that within the space. And but also I am, as I said earlier in my intro, I am the creative lead for Unbreakable Publishers, where we feature Asian stories told by Asian creators. And especially in TTRPGs, that is something that we would love to see more of. And so our work is never going to stop for a while. We do have 4 books coming out. We are actually having Unbreakable Volume 1 on sale. It ends on Wednesday. And let me see. If you want news on that, you can follow that Twitter account at unbreakable_pub. I had to think about that for a minute.
Awesome. Thank you, Jackie. And
Mhm.
Sam, where can people go to find you and check out all the things you're doing?
Sure. So I'm the verbal thing pretty much everywhere. I am a variety streamer here on Twitch. I tend to play a lot of like very chill games. And then I am also a writer and editor, as I think I mentioned earlier. So you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at The Verbal Thing. And then I also have a website, which is theverbalthing.com. But I have an essay published in an anthology called Fat and Queer that comes out on May 21st from Jessica Kingsley Publishers, which I'm super, super excited about.
Cool.
So you can find links to that on my website. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to like plug, but I think that's it. So
Awesome. Thank you. And Talia, where can folks go to find you and your work?
So for Clockwork Dominion and Eclipse Phase, there are things available on DriveThruRPG. Both games are also in distribution, so please ask about them at your friendly local game store. For Reliquary Game Studios, that's the company that does Clockwork, we are on various social media at A Clockwork World. So you can check us out on Facebook. We are not very active on Twitter, but we do have an account there. And also, of course, on TTRPG. And personally, I try to avoid using Twitter as much as possible. So nothing too much there for me personally.
So valid.
But I just want to also, since I know we're hard up against time, I just want to thank everyone for the invitation. I'm super excited that I was able to be here and be part of this fantastic conversation with all of you.
Same. And thank you, Celeste, for
Same.
moderating. This was
Oh,
great.
yes,
Yeah,
of
thank you,
course.
Celeste.
This was an absolute delight to get to talk to you all and get a look inside of your wonderful brains this morning. So, yeah, my name is Celeste Konowich. If you want to keep up with the podcasts I'm producing, the things I'm writing, the games I'm designing, the best way to do that is to follow me on Twitter at @ckonowich, or you can check out the full catalog of my work that you can buy, support, watch at celestekonowich.com. And right now, I am currently in the process of kickstarting and writing a book, The Venture Maidens Campaign Guide, which is a setting guide for a Femme Forged 5th edition actual play podcast. So I would love if you would check that out. Thank you so much to Lisa Penrose for having this awesome event. Thank you. Thank you for having us. You all have been lovely. Please do stick around. There's a bunch of awesome stuff coming for ArCONa. This is just the first panel of the day. Coming up next, we have TTRPG inspired by witchcraft and tarot, which sounds absolutely incredible. I'm definitely going to get a snack and come right back into this chair. And please do remember that all proceeds for this event are going to support Bat Conservation International's mission to end bat extinctions worldwide. It's a super worthy cause, and thank you all so much. I saw we all hit that goal during this panel, so thank you. You are amazing. But let's keep it going with those donations. Thank you so much to the moderators for being awesome. And you know what? Y'all rock. Go find the magic in yourselves and the games all around you. All right, folks. Well, have a good one.